Alright, how's everyone doing? All like 6 of you? Alright. Wait on a couple people, see if they show up in the next minute, but see. It doesn't know. Okay. Well, how's everybody doing? Did we get to do okay on the quotes, I hope, hopefully? Yes. I know some of you already turned it in during class, so if you haven't though, again, if you turn it in today, it's only 1 day late, so that means you would only lose 2%, which would be about, I don't know, like half a point at most for turning it in today. So again, just get it done if you haven't yet. I know there's some people who still need to finish, but just want to make sure everybody gets that done so that way they. All right, so today we're going to be focusing on introductions and conclusions. First half of class, I'm going to just kind of do a refresher on the introduction strategies. Then the second half of class, you guys will be given time to work on it. The homework is to finish introduction and conclusion paragraphs. Yes, I'm having you write your conclusion paragraph before you write the rest of your essay, but again, you guys will be able to see, okay. But this is going to be due Sunday night. Originally, I was going to have it due tonight, but I figured, well, I'll just give you guys the extra time if you guys need it. So I know you guys have other classes, so I want to make sure you guys have plenty of time to get that stuff done. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to get started talking about introductions. So introductions are basically just a way to introduce the reader to the topic, to get them engaged with the conversation that you're trying to have with them, and ultimately to have your thesis statement. So like, what's the purpose of your essay? Those are the three main things that you need to consider with your introduction. So again, there are 5 different types of introduction strategies, and I know I'm using the word strategies a lot. But so there's obviously, I know there's rhetorical strategies, there's introduction, conclusion strategies, so lots of strategies. But these are specifically just like ways to start your introduction. So for the inverted triangle again is when you start off with a broad topic and you get more specific as the paragraph goes on. So, and you guys have access to all these slides on Canvas, both in the slides page and also on the assignment that you're going to be doing. This is all in there. So here's an example. Weather, what type of weather? Bad storms. What specific bad storm? The rainstorm of 1996. What about it? This bottom part of the triangle is always going to be your thesis statement. This is like where you tell me what the point of the essay is. I had to abandon my car in a flash flood. It was the most frightening experience of my life, but I learned that I am stronger than I think. So if you were to go on to write an essay, you'd write an essay about this bottom part. Everything else was just like kind of building up to what the point of the essay is. So here's how you turn that triangle into a paragraph. So again, each part of the triangle becomes its own sentence. So first one, weather. The Midwestern states experience a wide variety of weather from bright, sunshiny springs and mild winters to wild summer storms. Now we get to what type of weather, specifically bad weather. The bad weather, our storms and tornadoes, gets the most attention. Okay, next, again, what type of bad, or which bad storm? One storm in particular, the record-breaking rainstorm that took place in September of 1996, will always stand out to me because it shaped who I am today. Now we get to the main point of the essay, the final sentence. During that storm, I had to abandon my car in a flash flood. It was the most frightening experience of my life, but I learned that I am stronger than I think. So again, just building off of each layer, basically, until we get to what the point of the essay is. Okay, next, narrative intro. So again, narrative intros are basically just where you tell a story, but at the end of your story, you still have to have a thesis statement. You still need to tell me what the point of your essay is. So for example, Sarah was in the small bedroom of her apartment, putting her infant son to sleep. As she was coming out of his room, she heard a loud thud. She looked down the hallway to see someone banging hard against the apartment door. As Sarah rushed back into the bedroom, she saw the front door burst open and a man she didn't know come through. Sarah slammed the bedroom door, grabbed the baby from the crib, and ran into the bedroom closet. She shut the closet door, still holding the baby in one arm, and started to frantically feel around for the shoebox that she kept hidden at the back of the closet. So the student ends the story here, but notice that it's not like a page long. A lot of times when students do like a narrative intro, they feel like that their story has to be like super long. Just keep it short and sweet. And then imagine that this wasn't here where it says this essay would start after this period. This essay will show that access to guns should not be further restricted so that people like Sarah have access to firearms for personal protection. This is not my opinion, this is just the opinion of this student. But again, it's a good example of a narrative where they have a thesis statement at the end that tells what the point is. So they've introduced the topic, they got the reader engaged, and then they finally told what the essay was going to be about. All right, this is a one that I think a lot of students think that this is one's going to be easy, and it can be actually a pretty easy introduction. But you just have to do it right. So the problem with this is that you all tend to revert back to being like in your 7th grade versions of you, where your English teacher told you to start a sentence with a hook, and they always say start with a question, but you end up sounding like a used car salesman or an infomercial salesman or whatever. So basically, rather than saying like, has this ever happened to you, which I don't ever want to see you guys write again because it's really boring. And it's like, oh God, one of these again. So the interrogative intro is basically you explain the topic, you give a statement about the topic, but then you ask questions that you're actually going to answer in your essay. So specifically, if you have like 3 body paragraphs, you're going to have 3 questions. So here's an example. So this essay prompt here is a made-up one. It's one that's about happiness. So everyone wants to be happier, but we don't often know if our choices will lead to happiness. Will more money bring more happiness? Does religion or faith in a higher power make people happier? Do we even have a right to happiness at all? This essay will seek to answer those questions by looking at the teachings of the Dalai Lama, insights from Gretchen Rubin, and opinions from C.S. Lewis. So there's no exact number of questions asked. If you have a longer paper, you're going to have more topics. So that means you can have more questions that you're going to answer in there. In the case of what we're doing, you would have probably 1 question for each of the 3 rhetorical strategies that you did. Let's say you chose scare tactics, patriotism, and anaphora for your 3 rhetorical strategies. For scare tactics, the question could be like, have you ever been driven by fear to make a change in your life? For patriotism, it could be, have you ever done something because of the love of your country? Or it doesn't even always have to be your country, it could be even your community. You could use patriotism for your community, it doesn't always have to be a national thing, or your state. And then for anaphora, have you ever thought about what an engaging way to convince people to do something is? So again, notice that I didn't use the names of the terms in the questions. They were questions that were related to the terms, but they weren't directly have you ever used logos before or something like that. You could, for logos, you could say have you ever thought about how logical reasoning could affect somebody's decision to do something? But that's essentially what interrogative is. You start with a statement about the topic. In this case, it is happiness. In your case, it'll be persuasion or using rhetorical strategies. You sandwich in between the statements, the thesis statement and this first statement, your questions that you're going to answer later. And then again, you end with the thesis statement. So that's basically how you do an interrogative. All right, next one. Paradoxical is kind of tricky and it doesn't work for every type of essay. I would say that you should probably avoid it for this one, but I'm still going to kind of explain it just so you kind of have an idea of what it is. First of all, a paradox is when you have two things that contradict one another. So a contradiction is like two statements that make each other false, basically. If something contradicts something, it's basically saying that the first statement's wrong. So here's an example of a paradox. So imagine you're walking down a trail and you come across a sign. It says no stopping and end in the same sign. Well, if you first glance at it, you probably think, well, it says that I'm not supposed to stop, but this is also the end. So it seems like they're contradicting. Obviously, common sense tells us that if you come across it, it's the end of the trail, so they don't want you to stop and clog up the trail and have a bunch of people waiting, right? So that's probably what that means. But if you first look at it, you probably think, well, that doesn't seem like that makes sense because it's two opposite statements. But in the larger context, it makes sense. So that's essentially what a paradox is. So a paradoxical intro is where you, if you're writing a paper about two things that seem like that they contradict one another, but both statements can be true. So in this example, it talks about how Henry David Thoreau, he's a famous philosopher, talks about how reading is the most fundamental. Literature is the highest form of art because it can be translated into any language, right? Lots of people read books that weren't written, for example, I read lots of books that weren't written in English originally, but they were translated to English. But he also makes the argument that even though they can be translated, that you should only read stories or books in their original language, because how many of you speak another language other than English? Okay, a few of you? Okay, so most of you know that not all, and even though I don't speak fluently in any other language, I've done some basic studying of other language. I've taken a class in Arabic, I took a couple semesters of Italian, I've taken Spanish. We have some friends who live in the Netherlands who are attempting to teach my wife and I Dutch, but that's not going well. But as you know, that not all words fit into the other language perfectly. The definition means something slightly different, in one language than it does in another. So that's why he's making the argument that you should read stuff in the original language, because even though somebody can translate it, it's not going to have the same exact meaning that it originally did in the original language. But anyways, that's a paradoxical intro where you present two statements that seem like that they're opposites of one another, but they're both true. Okay, mind the gap. Minding the gap is one you definitely can do. So the phrase minding the gap comes from the British subway system that they call the tube. And if you were to get on the train, they have a pre-recorded message that plays repeatedly saying, mind the gap. And it's basically talking about the gap between the platform and the train that you're getting on. Basically don't fall to your death onto the train tracks. And that's what mind the gap is. So in the introduction version of that is basically saying, here's a topic we all know about. And because we all know about that topic, you probably think you know everything there is to know, right? Wrong. I'm going to be telling you the information that you don't know about this topic, that I'm going to fill in the gaps of information that you don't know. So again, going back to the happiness one, when we think of happiness, we think only in positive terms. Increasing happiness is most often linked to things like improving your mental and physical well-being, building stronger relationships, attaining better status or financial security. So this first half is this is what you already know about happiness. This is what we all can assume about happiness. But what few people realize is that happiness is also directly tied to sadness. In order to be truly happy, we have to know suffering, pain, and loss so we can appreciate when our lives are improving. So it's everybody knows that in happiness, you want to improve your mental well-being, your financial well-being, that these are all ways to improve our happiness. But what you probably didn't know is that sadness is also something that we need in order to compare our relative emotions to. So again, that's what a mind the gap intro would look like. So for rhetorical strategies, you could talk about how you may know that these strategies can be really effective. You may know have heard a lot about ethos and pathos and logos, but did you know that there are other strategies that are even more effective than those? So that's one way that you can do a mind the gap one. Okay, conclusions. Like I said, I'm going a lot faster. Normally this is broken up over multiple days, but we've already done this before. But Daniel, I know not you because you weren't here for that, I don't think so. But still, you're getting a crash course into it. And again, if you need to look back at these slides, you can. So if I'm going too fast, or if you have questions, just stop me. But conclusions, basically, they answer the main claims of your essay. That doesn't mean you have to go like paragraph by paragraph and basically say everything you already said. And I'll just tell you the conclusions. I expect your conclusions to be shorter than your introduction. That's fine. The introduction has a lot more work to do than the conclusion paragraph. The introduction has to introduce a topic. It has to get you interested. It has to tell you what the whole purpose is. The conclusion, in my opinion, has a lot less to do because you've already made your arguments. You already told me what it was going to be about. Basically, you just need to kind of remind me what you wrote about and explain to me why it was important. That's essentially what a conclusion is. So echoing the intro conclusion is probably the paragraph you're most familiar with. And essentially what that is it's not repeating the intro, which a lot of you have probably been taught again, like the 7th grade views were taught. And that's where you like say, well, a conclusion is just the introduction, but you just get a thesaurus out and you change all the words in it. That's not exactly what you should be doing. So echoing the intro is where you take the introduction. So this is that inverted triangle one about weather from earlier. And then you just take a few words or phrases and then you just put it into the conclusion. So it's echoing what was said earlier. So that September day, bad weather changed the shape of my life. What started as a frightening experience, and then you see frightening experience here, turned into a learning experience. Now, it doesn't say learning experience, but it does say learn. So it doesn't have to be an exact match. Teaching me that I can survive the unexpected, that I can think clearly in an emergency, and that I should never leave the house unprepared. This is only 2 sentences. Sometimes the conclusion only needs to be a 2 to 3 sentence paragraph. That's why when I'm always asked, like, how long should this paragraph be? It depends. You know, like some paragraphs are going to be longer than others. Like, not every body paragraph that you write is going to be exactly 10 sentences. You might have to write a little bit more on some. You might have to write maybe like 9 sentences or 8 sentences, but like I said, there's no right answer for how long it needs to be. All right, challenging the reader. This is, to me, more interesting and more fun than the echoing the intro because you're being more creative about what people are doing with your information that you gave them. Rather than just saying, this is what I said all over again, now you're actually telling them, I told you all this information, now here's what you can do with it. So when you're doing a challenge the reader, though, I want you to steer clear of unrealistic. You want to make sure that it's something attainable that people can really do. So let's look at the differences. Realistic. Now that you know how much personal water use impacts our reserves here in California, I challenge you to set a timer when you shower and reduce your shower time to 4 minutes. If you have a lawn, reduce your watering to 8-minute cycles 2 days per week. These small changes could save 10,000 gallons per user per year. So again, most of us have phones. If you're going to take a shower, which God willing, I'm hoping that you all do, you basically set a timer for 4 minutes and you take your shower and then you try and get out in 4 minutes, right? That's something that's easy that people can actually do. If you have a lawn, a lot of people are having like lawnless landscapes now, drought tolerant landscapes. But if you still have a lawn, it's easy to just press a button and change it to 8 minutes instead of like 12 minutes, right? So realistic. Now, unrealistic, however, now that you know how much water storage is needed for the next drought, I challenge you to pass a law to build more water storage. Run for the state assembly so you can make some real legislative changes. Donate at least $10,000 to your local water district. I know I don't have $10,000 in my bank. I'm assuming you guys don't. If you guys do, congratulations. You have way more money than I do. But if I did have $10,000 in my bank, I can guarantee I wouldn't just give it to the water district. Also, running for state assembly, there's only so many state assembly seats, and there's literally millions of Californians. So the chances of you running for state assembly, let alone getting voted on to become part of state assembly, is pretty unlikely, just from an odds standpoint. Even if one of you did become a state assembly person in here, that would still leave the rest of the class who didn't, you know? So again, try to be realistic in your challenges. Try not to make them too like crazy, you know? Like for the rhetorical strategy, you wouldn't say like, just like Antony and Brutus, I'm trying to persuade you to convince all of Rome to do something. You know, you don't want to. If you told somebody to like convince one person, that'd be more realistic as opposed to like an entire nation, like Antony or Brutus did. All right, look to the future. Look to the future is kind of like putting you into the soothsayer role where you try to predict the future. And this one also has two versions, but you can do both of them. It just is your kind of style. Now, I tend to be in this camp. I am in everybody is going to die, glass is half empty kind of person. Unfortunately, it's a flaw of mine. That's who I am. So here's an example of the everybody is going to die version. If we don't start paying attention to the warnings of climate scientists, Earth will face more storms that increase in violence and frequency. The devastation we see from Superstorm Sandy or Hurricane Harvey may be just the beginning. Okay? Glass half empty, that's me. Sorry. Glass half full. If you make the changes that I've outlined today, we will see an immediate improvement in our CO2 levels, a decrease in our carbon emissions, lower global temperatures, and fewer forest fires. Imagine our national parks being restored to the pristine beauty of 200 years ago before the Industrial Revolution, in less than 30 years if we follow the plan recommended in this essay. So again, both of them are making predictions of what could happen. Obviously, this one is employing scare tactics to make people afraid of what could happen. This one is definitely taking a more positive tone in that, like, assuming that we can make changes that are gonna fix, what's going on. So both work. It just depends on your style, your attitude as a person. Posing the question, it's very similar to interrogative. In fact, so similar that if you choose interrogative for your introduction, don't use pose a question. Again, basically, if you start off with interrogative, if you end with pose a question, it sounds like you don't know what you're talking about, essentially. So you should only start with questions or end with questions. You shouldn't start and end with questions. So there is a slight difference too. So in the interrogative, you would have a statement about the topic, then like the questions, then like a thesis statement. For this one, it starts off with questions and ends with like some sort of like statement about like what's important. So are you as happy as you could be? Have you been looking to money for happiness, or have you looked to a higher power? Think about what hasn't brought you happiness and ask yourself if it's time to try something new. So these are questions that you had answered already in the body paragraph. This is a statement about what your ultimate like takeaway should be, what you learned from the information that was provided. Okay, so that's a pose the question. And then finally, conclude with a quote. Just like the paradoxical one, I would suggest that you all steer clear of this one, just because it could be a little trickier to do. For one, you can see that this is kind of a longer quote. It wouldn't be a quote from Julius Caesar. It would have to be a quote about the topic. So in this case, rhetorical strategies or persuasion. So if you found an interesting quote from somebody about, the art of persuasion or what's really effective in convincing people to do things, you could technically make that your conclusion. I personally think it's more trouble than it's worth unless you're really good with quotes and you like happen to know a good quote that's going to be really persuasive or really helpful for people. I would say just ignore it. Like I said, to me it's more tricky than it's worth. And you can't just find like a one sentence thing. Either it has to be like multiple sentences that makes it like really convincing. So I would just say ignore that one. Okay, finally done talking. We're going to lose my voice by the end of the day, but basically for the introduction and conclusion paragraphs that you guys are going to be writing, you're going to be using one of the strategies that we've discussed today to write your introduction, and then one of the conclusion strategies to write your conclusion. Again, you can always revise them in your final draft if you need to make changes, if you feel like that they need to be improved. I'm not expecting perfection. I'd rather you turn in a hot mess than turn in nothing at all, because I can tell you what needs to be fixed if you do that. And then the last thing that I am going to do real quick is I am actually going to write an inverted triangle and challenge the reader introduction and conclusion for the Thesis brief write. Obviously, I'm not expecting you guys to do it for Thesis brief write. That was just one paragraph. but I wanted to show you what it could look like. So for the inverted triangle, you can see I already wrote it up here for my earlier classes today. So starting off with a broad topic, persuasion. What type of persuasion? We're talking about how to persuade people, rhetorical strategies. Where are we seeing those rhetorical strategies being used? And Caesar, Act 2, Scene 2. And then finally my thesis statement. So now I need to turn those into sentences, right? So for inverted triangle, I would say something like, make it not bold. Persuading people is a difficult task, but it is important to know how to do it effectively and to avoid being manipulated by others who are trying to persuade you. Okay, because right, persuasion is a two-way street. It's good for you to know how to persuade people, but it's also good to recognize when somebody's trying to manipulate or persuade you to do something that might not be in your best interest. Okay, so that was my first part of the triangle, persuasion. Now I'm going to go down a step to rhetorical strategies. So the best way to persuade people, or I'm going to use a different word, so I'm not using persuade a bunch, to convince people to do something is to utilize rhetorical strategies. And that'll be good on that one. Okay. Next is going to be, where do I see that? Some strategies work better than others. Some strategies work better than others, which we see in, and then Julius Caesar, when you're talking about the name of the play and not the character, it needs to be in what's called italics. So up here, you'll see the little I icon. That's italic, and that makes those like letters kind of slanted. You use that whenever you're talking about the name of a play, a movie, a TV show, or a book. When you're doing short stories, the name of an episode, the name of a song, you would use quotation marks. But anyways, so some strategies work better than others, which we see in Julius Caesar. When Decius is trying to convince Caesar to go to the capital where the conspirators are planning to assassinate him. Okay, so that was my almost the end. So now we have the very bottom of the triangle, the thesis statement. That's the purpose of my essay. So in this essay, we will look to see how Theseus used, scare tactics, patriotism, and anaphora to persuade Caesar to ignore his wife and to go to the capital. Okay, so that's an introduction. That's the inverted triangle one where I start off with a broad topic and got more specific as it went along. Okay, and this is just what you guys are going to be doing too. Again, you don't have to use inverted triangle. It is an option, but you're going to label what type of introduction you're using. So now challenge the reader. Conclusion. So now that we have seen how, and then I'm going to list them again. One thing that's like good to think about is when you're listing things, like how I listed scare tactics, patriotism, and anaphora, that's the same order that my body paragraphs should be in too. And you should kind of list them like the same, like throughout the story, like in the same order. There we go. Now that we've seen how scare tactics, patriotism, and anaphora can be highly effective in persuading others, try to use these the next time you are in a situation where okay, so it was literally 1 second sentence. Now it was a longer sentence, and it easily could have been divided into maybe 3 shorter sentences. But that's it. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. So again, like I said, conclusions don't have to be these long, grandiose paragraphs, but this is what you're going to be doing the other day. You're going to pick one of the strategies, write an introduction for your essay. Obviously, you're not writing about Theseus anymore. You're writing about Antony and Brutus, how they convinced the Roman people to basically listen to what their goals were of their speeches. So Brutus wanted them to know why Caesar was killed. Antony wanted them to know that the conspirators were traitors. Okay, and then whatever conclusion you do, again, just make sure you like look at the ideas or the definitions of them, the examples that I gave you, and yeah, that's pretty much what you're working on. So you guys have about half an hour, roughly about 29 minutes to work on this. Do you guys have any questions about this? Like I said, obviously it's due Sunday, but try to get as much of it done as possible. That way you have less to do over the weekend. Okay.